This video is going to focus on, real people instead of fictional characters, and while usually we'd like to stray away from any sort of controversy, we're here to create information to people that used to be shunned before because of either homophobia or heteronormativity or any other of those big Tumblr words. So, without further ado, we'd like to introduce Are They Gay? John Lennon and Paul McCartney. The Beatles being of the immense size they were, no doubt that rumors of equal immensity developed from nothing. One of these being that John Lennon was homosexual. At first thought, any person would dismiss such thought as sensationalist bullshit. And though the idea has some merit to it, it isn't true. John Lennon was a lover of women, even adamant about it. Thus, it would be preposterous to assume that his interests lied with the male gender. However, liking women and liking men are not mutually exclusive. The thought never occurs to many that one can like both, but once it is propositioned forward, maybe we can reconsider John Lennon's sexuality and perhaps his relationship with Paul. Through anecdotes, stories, and by analyzing his relationships, we can conclude that there was more going on than we initially suspected. My initial doubts about Lennon's heterosexuality came with the book John Lennon: The Life by Philip Norman. It was panned by Paul McCartney and Yoko Ono alike, at least the part in which Norman claims that John was madly in love with Paul. Not only that fact, but the book claims that Lennon had sexual feelings toward his mother. And of course such incestuous ideas about this hero to many is preposterous. The book was dismissed as a container of lies, even if it was written by the same man who wrote Shout, a much acclaimed and long trusted biography. But what people failed to look into was Lennon's leaked audio diary, in which John himself states that he has sexual fantasies about his mother.
I was just remembering the time when I had my hand on my mother's tit in number 1 Longfield Road in off Mather Avenue near Garston. So when I was about 14, took a day off school, I was always doing that, hanging out in my house. I was lying on the bed and I was thinking, I wonder if I should be doing anything else. And it was a strange moment.
So it's established that perhaps some parts of the book have merit to them, and perhaps they're not as hogwash as they seem. What other parts could the book be accurate about? To quote the biography, "From chance remarks that Yoko had made, she gathered that there had been a moment where, on the principle that Bohemians should try everything, he, John, had contemplated an affair with Paul, but had been deterred by Paul's immovable heterosexuality." So the claim here is that John wanted Paul. He wanted Paul in that way. But examining whether John pined after Paul, and whether or not that this pining was requited, let's take a look at John's sexuality. John's sexuality first comes into question when Brian Epstein is brought up. Yes, of course, Brian Epstein, their gay manager who conveniently went on a trip with John alone to Spain together, while John's wife Cynthia was pregnant. Disregarding that fact that John and Paul also wanted to take a trip together to Spain, but instead ended up in Paris all by themselves, let's first talk about Mr. Epstein. Let's hear John on the subject. "I was on holiday with Brian Epstein in Spain, where the rumors went around that he and I were having a love affair. Well, it was almost a love affair, but not quite. It was never consummated. But it was a pretty intense relationship. It was my first experience with a homosexual that I was conscious was a homosexual. He had admitted it to me. We had this holiday together because Sin was pregnant, and I went to Spain. And there were lots of funny stories. We used to sit in the cafe at Torremolinos, looking at all the boys, and I'd say, 'Do you like that one? Do you like this one?'
If you ever leave me, I'll be sad and blue. Don't you ever leave me, I'm so in love with you."
One of John Lennon's former friends, Pete Shotton, wrote in the book, The Lives of John Lennon, that John had come to him about a holiday that him and Brian took to Spain, that Brian had propositioned John over and over, and John finally agreed and let him quote-unquote tossed him off. Take note of the phrase, "it was almost a love affair." Almost a love affair? Did that mean Lennon wanted to have an affair with Epstein? What did he mean by pretty intense? Was there unresolved sexual tension that he had yet to reveal to the public? Perhaps his ambiguous wording could have been cleared up. If John had not been shot 1 month after the interview was conducted, I think it is safe to assume that John was on the edge of revealing something to us. And I believe it is safe to assume that he and Brian did have an intense relationship. Intense enough to spark a small love affair, perhaps, but unfortunately the two people who know are dead. So one homosexual encounter does not prove someone is bisexual. There has to be more, and for Lennon there is. John's relationship with Stuart Sutcliffe was also a quote-unquote intense relationship as far as those go, to the point where Stuart's sister was convinced that John and Stuart had a homosexual love affair. Did her convictions have any merit? Of course we'll never be sure, as once again the two people in question are dead. But what are her suspicions based on? Surely she was close to Stuart, being her brother, and suspicions always arise. Or perhaps it was because, as she claims, John said himself at one point that this happened. Here are her own words on the matter. The interviewer asks, "Did you say, or did someone else say, that you believe John and your brother engaged in a homosexual relationship? How did you arrive at that conclusion? Did Stuart say something to you?" "Oh, honey, I don't have much more to say about this beyond what I've said in my book. Now, I was not the original source of that, okay? John was the original source, according to the other well-known writers or publicists or inner circle entourage. I'm not the originator of that. I have not confirmed that in any way. I simply say that I'm a very seasoned psychotherapist, and given they had a hugely intimate relationship, and also, as very young men became involved in a hugely decadent world then at the time, they could have explored something like that together. Who knows? I personally don't know. But I can see they might have done, or they might have not done. According to the written material out there, John is the person who originated that story. Now many would suspect, perhaps this woman is making it up. Perhaps she enjoys her 5 seconds in the spotlight. But what a modest way to push yourself into the limelight, to say they could have explored something like that together instead of saying, he was a full-on flamer. There is no incentive for her to fabricate the story about her brother. And though some will point to the attention she received, I believe that if attention is what she wanted, she would have found a better way to do it. But it was clear that John and Stuart had a very intense relationship, akin to the one that he and Epstein had. Here's a quote from Yoko Ono. "I felt I knew Stuart because hardly a day went by that John did not speak about him. And for John to continue to admire Stuart 20 years later is such a feat. I think it's a testament to the intensity of their relationship, which was surely more than the ordinary friendship." Paul recounts, "He and I used to have a deadly rivalry. I don't know why. He was older and a strong friend of John's. When I look back at it, I think we were probably fighting for John's attention." And of course there are simply chance remarks on Lennon's sexuality that further support the fact that John may have been anything other than straight. During John's lost weekend, a period of time when he and Yoko were separated, John tells us some of what happened. "I was trying to put it around that I was gay, you know. I thought that would throw him off, dancing at all the gay clubs in Los Angeles, flirting with the boys. But it never got off the ground. A story that very well could have been an act of desperation in a desperate time. But how many straight men do you know go to a gay bar when they're suddenly a bachelor? What was John's mindset? And what exactly did flirting entail?" John was very conscious of people's suspicions, and often very erratic about that fact. Pete Shotton brings us another account. The two of them dropped acid one night in 1967, and they ended up in his attic, and they both passed out on the floor. The next morning they were awakened by the maid trudging in at the attic stairwell. John woke up, and on hearing her footsteps, suddenly shot to his feet saying, "Oh Christ, she'll think we've been fucking." Did John think his wife was that suspicious of him? Was he trying to hide the fact that much? What an odd thing for a supposedly straight man to worry about. So I believe that by now perhaps it has been established that John wasn't as straight as an arrow. Perhaps his inclinations were a little bit shifted, as many people's are. But the question stands. What about him and Paul? Paul, by all accounts and measures, is an undoubtedly straight man. He's comfortable with that fact, and that's perfectly fine. However, the questions come with his response to John's homosexual leanings. When Philip Norman in his biography had brought up John's gay leanings, Paul and Yoko were apparently furious that Norman could make such a claim that John was in love with Paul. Yoko understandably denies this fact, or perhaps she denies it not because it was untrue, but because of her rivalry with Paul McCartney. Or just disdain with the fact that John could be in love with anyone but her. What is Paul's incentive for denying the fact, however? John was his best friend. He had to have suspected something about John. Given all these stories, especially John's relationship with Brian and Stu, Paul still claims that there wasn't even a hint. Here is Paul speaking on the matter in the 1980s, when a book claiming John was a homosexual was published.
He certainly had some wild periods that he admitted to, but a lot of people have that. I think where he starts to exaggerate and says that John was possibly homosexual, I think he throws that in with some of the truth, and it starts to have the same credence as the real truth.
Paul further goes on to say,
There certainly are things that I've only dipped into it, actually, Albert, but revelations, well, you know. And I say, if he's homosexual, I would have thought he'd make a pass at me in 20 years, darling.
And although it is said in a joking tone, it seems to be a fact that Paul returns to time after time, the thought that if John were gay, he would have wanted me. In 2012, the same question was brought up again on Howard Stern.
Show.
You never made love to a man.
So, no, I haven't actually, no.
There's a new book out about John that claims
Have you read that book?
Have you read that?
You know, that rumor came out a long time ago, and the thing was, the person that started the rumor, the book that it was in,
Right.
he didn't know John.
Right.
And whereas I did. So I said to people, you know, around about that time, I said, look, I was on tour with John. I grew up with John. We slept in the same bed in hotel rooms. We topped and tailed it like kids do, you know, and you're growing up. And I said, and never once did I see any hint of that. Now, you know, we spent drunken nights together.
Right.
I think there would have been a hint.
Once again, Paul's denials are simply a matter of, well, if he was gay, he would have wanted me. When Paul claimed that he needs some sort of hint, he fails to recall John's relationship with Brian or Stuart's relationship with John. Instead, he claims once again that if John were gay, John would have wanted him. If John didn't want Paul, then John didn't want any man, according to McCartney. In the 1980s, when the rumors first appeared, McCartney also made the statement,
It's tough. Now, if you look at John for his stability, you've got to look at a guy whose his father left home when he was 3, who was brought up by his auntie and his uncle. His auntie was lovely, but the uncle died. And then his mother, who used to live nearby, was visiting one night. She left, she got run over by a drunken policeman and got killed stone dead when he was 16. His first marriage failed. So, you know, and on top of all of that, it's remarkable that he was as straight as he was, really.
and though I'm sure that quote came out of the misunderstanding of homosexuality in the 1980s, it only goes to show how little Paul understood about sexuality at the time, that an unstable childhood could somehow cause homosexuality. In 2012, Paul seems more understanding about sexuality, but still returns to the "he must have wanted me" state of mind. Based on quotes and remarks being made about the Lennon-McCartney dynamic, one can assume that their relationship was intense, and perhaps as intense as the relationship that John shared with Brian Epstein or Stuart Sutcliffe. Here are a few that come to mind. Paul says, "We were each other's intimates. Paul and I knew each other on a lot of different levels that very few people know about. Whatever bad things John said about me, he would always slip his glasses down at the end of his nose and say, 'I love you.' That's what I really hold on to. That's what I believe. The rest is just showing off." And this is George about one of their nights in Hamburg. One time Paul had a chicken bed and John came in and got a pair of scissors and cut all her clothes into pieces and he wrecked their wardrobe. He got like that occasionally. It was because of the pills and being up too long. Yeah, George, it was because of pills. Perhaps a mix of drug-induced rage, or a sincere rage, stemming from John's disdain for the women that Paul courted. It seems like the act of a frustrated man in a time of desperation. Once again, we turn to Philip Norman for Yoko Ono's perspective. Nor apparently was Yoko the only one to have picked up on this. Around Apple in her hearing, Paul would sometimes be called John's princess. She had also once heard a rehearsal tape with John's voice calling out, "Paul, Paul," in a strangely subversive and pleading way. "I knew there was something going on there," she remembers. From his point of view, not from Paul's, and he was so angry at Paul I couldn't help wondering what it was really about. One other hit that John was perhaps far more intimate with his bandmate than any of us suspect comes post-mortem. In January 1994, Paul McCartney was given 2 tape cassettes by Lennon's widow Yoko Ono that included home recordings of songs Lennon never completed or released commercially. On one of the tapes, the words "For Paul" had been scrawled hastily in John's handwriting. The songs on the tape included "Grow Old With Me" and "Now and Then." These songs were clearly love songs, and love songs that had never been completed.
Well, we will know for sure that
Perhaps towards the end of his life, given that he was on the edge of revealing the truth about him and Brian, John was becoming more open with his sexuality, more specifically, his true feelings towards Paul, whatever that may be. It seems apparent to anyone who researches the topic that John was far from being the staunch heterosexual that Paul makes him out to be. Given John's relationships and attitudes as a whole, one can surely make the conclusion that John had interests outside the realm of women. If none of this convinces you, why don't you take Yoko's word for it? Let us dig into what the lovely Yoko had to say about Mr. Lennon's sexual orientation. Well, that's another thing. John and I had to talk about it, saying basically, all of us must be bisexual. And we were sort of in a situation thinking that we're not bisexual because of society. So that's innocent enough. So John and Yoko agreed that everyone is bisexual, and that means by default, so are they. But what about John specifically? Did John Lennon have sex with other men? I think he had a desire to, but I think he was too inhibited. No, not too inhibited. He said, "I don't mind if there's an incredibly attractive guy. It's very difficult. They would have to not be just physically attractive, but mentally very advanced too. And you can't find people like that." I think a lot of what attracted John to Yoko was her intellect. She was an intellectual equal to him. John liked beautiful people with beautiful minds. Now, who else was John's intellectual equal? Perhaps a partner in work, a best friend? Oh, that's right, Paul McCartney. I have a very funny feeling that if Paul weren't straight, John would have taken the chance as soon as he could. But that's only a feeling after all. It's a little weird, though, how Paul said that there was never a hint of John being anything other than straight. Paul, his songwriting partner and best friend, somehow just didn't get the obvious, if I do say so myself, hint. Being his lifelong best friend and still somehow not knowing or even suspecting John's more than obvious leanings does not seem to add up. So either Paul is the most oblivious man in the world or he's hiding something. They certainly had an immensely intimate relationship. No doubt in my mind would make me think any different of that fact, and I am sure they have never doubted that themselves. And perhaps John tried to hide his affections, or repress them in an effort to hide them from his songwriting partner. These repressed feelings certainly come out as anger in their post-breakup feuds.
You took your lucky break and broke it in two. Those freaks was right when they said you was dead. Dear friend, throw the wine. I'm in love with a friend of mine.
Their relationship was deep, and even fragile for a period of time before John's death. There is certainly an understandable reason why Paul would want to have kept John's leanings a secret. The question of whether or not John or Paul's relationship was ever consummated is one left for speculation. However, it is undeniable that John and Paul's connection, though unconsummated, is deeper than any of us can understand, perhaps too deep for even them to understand. No matter what has been said or what evidence can be brought up, it is unfortunate that the only man who can defend himself is no longer with us. So John was most likely bisexual, and that's okay. possibly infatuated with Paul, and he had maybe tried to take it a step further. We'll never know. Lennon was a complex character entangled in a complex relationship. A relationship that words on a page or a video could never fully explain. Were they gay? Or bisexual in this case? You decide.